My name's Simon Gilliland. I'm a business growth leader in the WSP's water business in the UK. And today I'm going to be taking you through a presentation on a truly one-of-a-kind innovation in the property flood resilience space, the FloodSafe House. In terms of the agenda for what we'll be kind of covering in the presentation today, it's on the screen now, hopefully. Just a couple of kind of housekeeping notices as we start as well. There is a question box in the left-hand side or right-hand side of your screen, depending on the way you've got it configured. Do add in any questions as we go along, and we'll seek to answer as many of those as we can, during the presentation or at the end. There's also a handout of the presentation which you can download there as well at the side. So agenda-wise, initially I'll be talking around why we should focus on flood resilience at all in the first place. Why is it important? And then look into a little bit more about how generally flood resilience is approached at that property level. Then I'll talk a bit more about the actual innovation, which is FloodSafe House, and then WSP's role in this project thus far, and then moving on to some of those wider applications before we go into the Q&A. So then, to begin with, why focus on flood resilience? Well, if we just look at the UK as an example country, you can see some stats there on the screen. Over 5 million people live in flood risk areas. That's a significant number of people when you think that the UK population is around about 67 million people, and 1 in 6 homes is at risk of flooding. And then annually, that flood damage cost is around about 1.3 UK pounds, which is obviously a significant amount of expense. And then thinking more broadly about some of those challenges and factors that influence flood resilience going forward, climate change and predicted global sea level rises of 1 metre by 2100. And then a challenge which is maybe to a degree unique to the UK, but is equally true of many countries around the world. We're an island nation with limited capacity. There's limited land to meet growing housing demand. So there's a need to build often in areas that are at high risk of flooding. If we kind of broaden that out a bit further and look at the world as a whole, then globally, 29% of the world's population have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So that's 2.2 billion people. And as you can see from the map there, which is the World Bank's kind of info, there's a lot of pink on there. There's a lot of flood risk. It's not just a UK problem. This is a global problem. There's a need to think about how we build flood resilience in our communities around the world. So how do we make properties flood resilient? There are generally 3 main ways in which properties can be made flood resilient. Flood resistance, which is in essence about stopping water physically entering into a building. So that might be using gates, barriers, non-return valves, different systems to physically stop water entering into a building. Now, there's a limit to how far that can go because the structure of a building is also essential to not be compromised. But flood resistance is a key measure of providing that resilience. Then there's what we'd call flood resilience, which is about actually providing interventions within the property itself, allowing the water in, but then reducing the impact of that flooding. So that might mean raising electrical sockets, using finishings that are water resilient, that can be wiped down and not be damaged by a flood event. And then the third category, which is where FloodSafe House fits in, is flood avoidance, which is very much about avoiding that flood risk issue completely. Elevating a property above floodwater in the case of FloodSafe House. Which moves me on to FloodSafe House here. You can see it on the right of the screen, and I'll set a video going now as you can see it elevating itself. So FloodSafe House, what is it? Well, in essence, it's fundamentally a low carbon, steel framed off-site manufactured house. But rather than just being a standard off-site manufactured house, it's been inbuilt with screw jacks, which in essence elevate it 1.5 meters, up to 1.5 meters above floodwater. Now it does that, obviously the jacks raise the property, but it utilizes smart sensors located around it that can detect that rise in water level and ensure that it raises itself and keeps itself 150 millimeters above the floodwater at all times. As a system, it's a cost-effective solution to protecting occupants, fixtures, fittings and possessions, because in comparison often to more traditional flood risk mitigation solutions, it is cheaper, and I might come on to that later, and there may be some questions around that later. Also, it reduces the impact of emergency services. There's not that need to evacuate or bring in emergency services for a property like FloodSafe House, because it elevates itself out of the risk. And as far as the UK is concerned anyway, with this prototype, it looks like a normal house. So as a project, it's a long-standing research and development partnership between Floodjack International, the inventors of the system, Hadley Group, the principal investors, University of Liverpool in the UK, who've provided a lot of that academic research input, and then WSP, who've had a kind of a lead role in advising and guiding the project along its steps thus far. So that's been a 5-year collaboration by WSP with these partners, and we're very much coming to a point where things are now moving towards commercial launch. So rigorous testing of the actual system is due to start at the HR Wallingford Hydraulic Research Institute at Oxford in the UK, and that will, in essence, the house will be sat there in a big water tank and subjected to all of the elements in order to test and make sure that the home is safe for its occupants, can withstand the hydraulic loadings, the wind loadings, all those things, debris loadings that might affect a house like this in a flood event. Alongside that, discussions with insurers are really well advanced. We're confident we've got an insurable system as far as the UK market is concerned anyway. And as I touched on, commercial launch of the house is expected this year. You'll also notice in the photo on the right-hand side there, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who visited FloodSafe House back in June 2020, very much seeing this potentially as one way of addressing the flood resilience challenge in the UK at least. So WSP's role in the project thus far has very much been as lead technical advisors to all the other partners involved in the FloodSafe House project, providing guidance and direction along the journey thus far. So key elements of that have been stakeholder engagement, so that's been engaging with national and local government, the regulators that will sign off and ultimately ensure that the system can become a commercial reality, and also there's insurers who need to be happy that it's a safe, reliable system, that it's robust enough to stand up to the elements of flooding and will be can be occupied and lived in going forward. Research and innovation funding, we've assisted with that along the way as well to ensure that the project could keep moving forward at pace. The testing regime, which is about to start, as I mentioned, in the HR Wallingford later this month, we've been involved in setting that up and also developing that testing program. A link to that, there's also a digital twin of the house that we're developing, because that time that we're going to have the house physically there at Wallingford is limited. So the digital twin is essential really for the project moving forward, to be able to test it outside of lab conditions. If we can have a digital twin of the house, we can do all that extra testing that we might need at a later stage. Then moving forward, as things progress towards that commercialisation of the system later on in the year, WSP is starting to get involved in due diligence of potential sites for flood-safe homes, understanding what the local conditions are, because flood-safe house can very much be tailored to site-specific conditions. So it's important that we understand what those conditions are to know how best to design the system, the gear ratios for the motors, etc., to ensure that the house is safe and can respond appropriately to the specific flood conditions in any given location. And then the master planning and the infrastructure design, so actually developing the designs and helping the flood-safe homes come forward through the planning process. WSP will play a central role in that going forwards too. So I've talked a little bit there about the house itself, but then kind of thinking about some of those wider applications for the technology, the Floodjack system that powers the FloodSafe House. Some of the things that are being looked at the moment are retrofitting. So taking the actual technology that we're applying with the house that's been shown thus far to a modular off-site constructed property and then saying, can we retrofit this technology into existing properties? So there's work already underway to develop that retrofit system. Alongside that, looking at actually applying the technology to other sectors. So the technology doesn't just have to sit within a residential context. It could equally apply in a water, energy, commercial, other sectors. There's often, say, for the water sector, for example, water sector assets need to be located in areas of high flood risk. There's just no two ways about it. They need to be close to those water bodies that do on occasion cause flooding. And so having such technology for equipment and infrastructure and kit in those areas is potentially a real transformational innovation. Similarly, another interesting thing we're also looking at is data harvesting. There's lots of data that's created by a network of flood-safe homes in any development, or networks of flood-safe homes if you have a number of developments around the country or around the world, and actually being able to use that data and interrogate it in some way, linked with kind of machine learning and various other factors. We're actually looking to try and develop smart flood warning forecasting systems. So WSP Floodly is a system that we've been working on in the UK, which the Environment Agency have been really positive about thus far. And that, as a system, would really benefit from all this smart data that could help it to better predict flooding before it happens. A really kind of key thing there that I sort of addressed down the fourth point about the net zero carbon. So it is a modular off-site constructed home. So fundamentally, it's a lower carbon housing solution. And with the climate emergency which we face as a world and all the challenges posed by climate change, then focusing on new developments and new infrastructure being low carbon is very much the way to go. So this being a solely net zero carbon solution at present is something that's really exciting as well about the FloodSafe House system. I'm now going to show a video on the screen. So this is a mocked up video for a development of flood-safe homes, approximately 100 flood-safe homes in the UK. You obviously notice these are very UK looking kind of homes. Equally, they could be homes anywhere in the world. And as a development, what we can see on the screen now is sort of fixed sensors. There'll be fixed sensors around any development. So these are kind of bollard sensors is how we've envisaged this working kind of initially. In terms of redundancy within the system, here's what's shown is I guess a backup kind of power control sort of station, and this is elevated above the floodwater. The homes themselves, alongside the fixed sort of bollard type sensors that would sit around the development, there would also be sensors underneath each property. So what you'll see on the screen shortly is will show that as floodwater begins to rise, the sensors around the development and also under each property, as you can see on the screen now, would detect that rising water and cause each property to elevate itself up above the floodwater. So as you can see now, each home is operated independently from each other. They're networked to a degree from a sensoring perspective, but each property can elevate itself separately above the floodwater. So as you can see on the screen now, the floodwater is kind of coming in, and each home is beginning to elevate itself above the floodwater. And as I mentioned earlier, each home can elevate itself at present with the current model that we have around 1.5 meters above ground level. And the speed of that rise can be tailored to the site-specific conditions. So in a rapid onset flooding scenario, the properties can rise at a quicker rate. As you can see underneath the property now, the legs are submerged. There's kind of thick kind of rubber bellows around each of the screw jacks on the corner of each of the homes, and they provide that added protection just in case there were a scenario where debris impacted on those jacks. And here, if debris is caught between the property and the ground surface when it kind of comes down, the actual system can sense that and stop itself as well. And then following a flood event, there'd be that need just to do that, inspection of each property, make sure that there've been no issues and no concerns before it can be put back into service. So that brings me to the end of the presentation now. So before we start on the Q&A, just a few key takeaways that I'd like to kind of flag up. So FloodSafe House is an innovative approach. It's a one of a kind. There's nothing like this at all in the world, in the market at present. And it's currently approaching commercialization in the UK. It's a one of a kind approach to making properties and communities resilient to flooding. It facilitates development in areas of risk of flooding. Now, clearly, we generally want to avoid areas at high risk from flooding, but this actually enables safe development in areas of high risk of flooding. As I've mentioned a few times, commercial launch of the FloodSafe House in the UK is due to happen this year. And it's a cost-effective, low-carbon, safe and insurable solution. You know, those calculations have been done in terms of the economics, in terms of the carbon, in terms of the safety and the robustness of the system. And after the testing at HR Wallingford is complete in the UK, we'll have a system which we are happy with and something that will be able to come to market fully. And then, yeah, I guess a key point as well to flag up there is that the technology can be applied to different sectors and property types. It's not confined to just a UK housing type. It could be applied to other housing types. The technology itself could be applied in other sectors as well. It's an important point to make. So that brings me to the end of the presentation today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. I'll now take some questions as we have them, and hopefully Sharon is on the line to oversee the Q&A now.
Thank you, Simon, for your presentation. It will be great if you can open your webcam so we can see you. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of this presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. So we receive a lot of questions. I will start with the first one. Can this be made to meet building and flood regulations internationally?
Good question. Yep, we've obviously got a global audience on the line today, which is great. So yeah, I'm very much focused on the UK because it's a UK-honed developed technology, and we're developing it for the UK market initially. But there's no reason why it couldn't be applied in other countries to other housing types. I think as a system, fundamentally, it works well with modular off-site constructed properties, and we have designed it initially, at least anyway, with residential properties in mind in the UK. But there's no reason why it couldn't, be applied, the technology, in another jurisdiction. Clearly, there would be those challenges in terms of insurance, in terms of kind of regulations that would need to be overcome. But I guess what I'd say is that if we are at the verge of overcoming those challenges in the UK, then I would say the technology is nearly at that place where we could actually apply it in another country. Yeah.
Thank you. Should we be encouraging residential development in areas of high flood risk?
Good question. Okay. Yeah, I guess it's one of the probably more contentious aspects of FloodSafe House is that it technically allows residential development in areas of high flood risk. So generally speaking, in Western countries at least, there is a preference for developing residential homes in areas of lower flood risk, because you don't generally want vulnerable residential dwellings in areas that flood regularly. It doesn't kind of make sense. What I would say is that actually this opens up that possibility. In every instance, it might not be appropriate. There's no sort of silver bullet solution, though, when it comes to flooding. We actually need to kind of look at a full, broad range of solutions. And so I would say FloodSafe House could be a really great solution in some parts of the UK, in other kind of locations around the world, where there's a serious, significant flood risk challenge, where there's that need to actually protect communities that are in a location near to a flood risk source. Those communities want to stay in those locations near a flood risk source. There's that need for inward investment in those areas, actually allowing and enabling residential development in areas of high flood risk. If it can be done safely, which it can with FloodSafe House, then we shouldn't keep it off the table. We should enable it. We should think about it. We should look to kind of work with innovative technologies like this to see if we can make them viable in those areas. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and it is contentious to a degree, but I'd say we can do it safely. With FloodSafe House, we can. Why not look into it, and why not make it happen?
Thank you. You mentioned that FloodSafe House is a cost-effective solution. Can you please elaborate on this point?
Yes, I realised I did mention that, but then didn't go into great detail about why it's cost effective. Well, I guess there's a number of different angles to this. Fundamentally, if we're talking about development in areas of higher flood risk, that land is cheaper, significantly cheaper. So the added cost of a flood safe system is is nothing in comparison to that the cost benefit that is brought by that cheaper land. So the land is cheaper. The technology can be actually, as it's mass produced and broadened out in terms of its spread, it can be rolled out effectively. So when you've got the cheaper land in conjunction with technology, which as smart as it is, and it's a great system, FloodSafe House, I would say that. I think the inventor is on the line, so I need to actually say that. As smart and great as a system as it is, actually a lot of the parts are fairly standard. The jacks, the motors, the control panel is the genius in terms of actually how that works and the way that the sensors, work in collaboration with that control panel each property. But the main components of it, they're not particularly wild and ridiculous. They're fairly standard elements, which, well, you won't be able to pick up in your local shop, but you can find fairly readily. And yeah, again, it may look expensive, but as a system, it's not expensive as it looks, particularly when the cheaper value of the land is factored in.
Thank you. Is the FloodSafe House resilient to all types of flooding?
Yeah, very much so. So I did touch on it in the presentation that as a system, it can be tailored to the site conditions. So we could adjust the gearing ratios, for example, with the motors, so that it can rise at the speed of the incoming floodwater. So if that's a coastal breach scenario, where the water level goes from 0 to kind of 1.5 meters in a matter of minutes, the system can be adjusted to those site conditions. One of the things I really like about it is that, particularly with climate change, there's so much uncertainty about what that flood risk is going to be over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years. Actually, with a flood safe system, you can tailor it to the local conditions. Should those local conditions change, we can adjust it. We can go back in, maybe adjust the gearing ratios to the motor, put a new motor in. If the jacks need to be more robust or they need to go higher, we can switch the jacks out. It's got interchangeable parts, really. So that adaptability of the system is really, really interesting. And I guess the way I'd sort of describe FloodSafe House, I'd compare it to like a sprinkler system. You hope there'd never be a fire in a building, but if there is a fire, you'd be glad you've got a sprinkler system there. Similarly with this floodjack system, you hope you're not going to flood, but if you do, you've got a system that's going to protect you, it's going to protect your possessions, and that is that added reassurance that people would want that are living in those kind of flood-prone areas.
Thank you. How will we be able to encourage poorer members of society to adapt expensive changes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That sort of social value piece, and I think if you spoke to the inventor of Floodjack, the Floodjack system, the FloodSafe House, who's on the line today, like a massive part of this for him is about bringing about that wider social value. So often, it's not always the case, but often areas that risk, are at risk from flooding and flood regularly are located in poorer, more socially disadvantaged areas. That is generally the case. We see that around the world, and that's seen at a local level in the UK as well. And when you sort of see that, you recognise that this is not something that maybe those people have the ability to buy themselves. I guess a flood safe house, which is why there needs to be that collaboration between ourselves inventing a system, between governments that have the funds potentially to actually make this system happen and it be sort of broadened out and applied. And I think that whole sort of social value question is really, really important. So we need to make sure that we're all working together to ensure that those socially disadvantaged communities, which often flood, worse than other areas, can actually have the funds and the resources to actually protect themselves. We can't just ignore those communities, can we? We can't just leave them to kind of get on, we actually need to kind of be thinking creatively about how we protect those vulnerable communities. And FloodSafe House is a way for people to stay where they're living at present in their own communities, but to stay there safely. So there's a massive social value dimension to this, but it will need funding. And I think that there's a great argument, a great case that could be put across there for governments actually seeing this at a local level and taking some responsibility for bringing that flood risk improvement in their areas.
Thank you. How are water and drainage connection made to allow for a vertical movement?
Sure, great question. Yeah, so absolutely, the properties go up and down. What happens with the water connections? What happens with the drainage connections? So that's something we've looked at in a lot of detail as well. So I guess in essence, what I would say is that there'd be a kind of umbilical cord type system or a smart kind of connection. We've got designs for those which are currently being progressed. So in principle, it's not new. It happens on other systems, for example, like bridges and other kind of infrastructure that needs to kind of move, whether that obviously be a bridge or something internally within factories, for example. There's regularly a need to actually have services that can flex and move. So we've seen some existing designs, and we've got designs that we're pulling together for the FloodSafe House. So yeah, it's a good question, and we've got a solution for it. Yeah.
Thank you. How long can the houses sit in an elevated position without failure?
Indefinitely, to a degree. So I touched on like the redundancy within the system. So the thinking thus far is that there would be obviously the main power supply to each home that would enable the house to rise. There would be a kind of backup generator located on the site as well. But then also there'd be a battery kind of base system within each property. And then physically, you could probably go down and winch up the system if you wanted to. So there's a number of levels of redundancy there. So as a system, if once the house kind of elevates itself up into the air, if there was a power cut, if all of the redundancy kind of failed, then it would stay in the air, in essence, is what I'm saying. So that it can stay up there indefinitely, but with all those extra redundancy, what would happen is that the system is designed to actually keep itself 150 millimeters above the rising floodwater. So as the floodwater recedes, the house actually drops and de-elevates itself to ground level. So it shouldn't ever really be stuck in that position. But if it were, then it's safe. These jacks, they're serious, robust bits of kit. They're obviously designed for the property and the loadings that it's likely to experience, and all that testing is going to be underway. So yeah, it's not an issue if all that redundancy within the system actually failed. The house would be safe. It would just stay fixed at that kind of level.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon, so much. Thank you for all your questions. We received many, many more questions that we don't have time to read within the 30 minutes webinar. So thank you for all these questions. These will be answered directly by Simon. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Simon, for a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed listening to this and learning about this. Thank you very much, everyone.